Hello, and welcome to the March 2022 ENSO seminar. We are very lucky to be joined today by Shay Welch from Spelman College. Shay is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Spelman and Carnegie Corporation Rockefeller Foundation of Distinguished Research and Creative Scholar, and Chair of the Association for Feminist Ethics and Social Theory. Amongst a range of other positions and roles. Two previous books include Existential Eroticism, a Feminist Ethics Approach to Women's Oppression, Perpetuating Choices, and A Theory of Freedom, Feminism and the Social Contract. And I think we can kick off indeed with a plug and commercial break, as it were, Shay, for your new book, which I'll let you introduce.
Great. Yeah, so this is kind of ironic and a little bit unlucky timing because my new book is coming out in about 2 weeks. And it's basically taking all of this research on enactivism and explaining how choreography can work as a mode of embodied critical inquiry. So in my previous book, I talked about how enactivism, embodied cognition, and embodied metaphors can be used to communicate objective knowledge. And then in the new book, I talk about how it kind of works in reverse and how people can use creative movement to actually find the questions that they have in themselves. And I use a lot of somatic work, and this ties into a lot of the enactivist affect theory. So that will be coming out in 2 weeks, and I hope that you will be interested in checking it out. Elena got a preview of the book, and she seemed to not think it was terrible, so I was really excited to hear that. And then this work, I was so when I found all of this literature, it kind of changed my whole intellectual life and trajectory because it had given me the tools to substantiate all of my other claims that I had been making about the body in democratic and oppressive context. And once I got a hold of it, I have just not been able to stop taking it and applying it into further and further actions. So the work that I did in this recent book on somatic work, I did some stuff on partner work to talk about how linguistic bodies make it possible to have embodied dialogues using somatic work. And so this project is even taking it further, right? And I'm talking about how linguistic bodies can do the same exact thing, but across time and space in democratic context. So the hope is that I pull it off, and I hope that you can go with me on this journey.
Well, now I'm even more excited. And I'm kind of feeling privileged as well. We're getting the sequel before the book even comes out. So
yes, you are in fact.
But look, it sounds brilliant. It sounds also sort of very inactive. That whole notion of no determinate finish, just a continuous becoming over time. Yeah. is the kind of theme that I think definitely follows from the kinds of work that we've been seeing coming out of the enactive literature more broadly in the last few years. And it is very exciting to see it brought into new domains and to see it flourish and to be useful, I think, in domains outside of the original cognitive scientific context and philosophy of mind and stuff there, where it originally arose or emerged. So we have a number of people watching live. We have a distinguished guest, as it were, here present with us, and I think we are at this point ready to go. So without further ado, I would invite you to give the May 2022 ENSO seminar.
Great. I do apologize to people. I am reading a paper. It is the awful analytic philosopher inside of me that cannot just present. So just bear with me, okay? All right. Dance is regarded as inherently political. Historically, it has been conceived of as an effective means of public protest. For this reason, it is important for scholars to give attention to just how precisely dancing can be a communicative device in the public sphere. Although dancers scholars have been exploring and attesting to the radical communicative and revolutionary of dance all along, many scholars, including philosophers, seem to include dance in their analyses through passing remarks, as metaphors, or as just one other thing in a series of items following an e.g. Right? But this superficial inclusion of dance as capable of political speech has resulted in missing some of the more interesting and illuminating ways in which bodies are necessarily political and linguistic. My purpose in this project is to shorten the distance between the political reality of the here and now and feminist democratic ideals by revealing just how agentic the body can be. And further, just how communicative it can be in light of our bone-deep subjectivity. I argue that dance can have democratic import through an embodied narrative contribution to the realm of public reasons. Using the enactive model of linguistic bodies, I substantiate dancing as a particularly participatory mode of democratic participation vis-a-vis its function in participatory sense-making. I look into the role of dance as a participatory democratic operation to analyze how dancing bodies operate linguistically, such that their role of meaning-making extends beyond communal sense-making into the realm of collective reasoning via reason-giving and reason-sharing. I argue that dancing in action is a reason-giving practice that can proffer illicit communication from the body and can be given uptake by another body. So some background on deliberative democracy. Broadly speaking, the fact of sociality is the fact that community members largely possess a shared social language of meanings and sets of practices. These practices include linguistics, nonverbal perlocutionary gestures, or embodied communications, which are all facets of interdependence and intersubjectivity. Communities use these concepts and practices to manufacture shared moral concepts through practices of discursive engagement. To do so, individuals must negotiate the meanings of such concepts through formal and informal mediums of interaction. Subsequently, those concepts then configure into shared moral understandings. This is why there are so many proponents of deliberative democratic models. Salah Ben-Habib characterizes deliberatory democracy as one that involves equal and symmetrical participation governed by norms for interaction. So I'm hoping our linguistic bodies people can kind of pick up on like little gems that I'm dropping about why I'm seeing the direct parallel here. Ben-Habib advocates for this discursive model because individuals do not possess sufficient knowledge apart from others for reasonable decision-making about arrangements. Discursive processes function dynamically, contributing both to the inputs and outputs of communicated exchanges. Participatory discursive practices construct individuals' shared understandings of the common good and also generates principles for reasoning about their collective interests. These shared understandings are constructed by, and in return, feed back into communicative activities that keep community members incessantly connected, even when they are not in direct interaction. Discursive deliberative democratic practices facilitate collective shared understandings since the logic of participatory processes has an educative effect. Dialogical interaction formulates a public interest that differs from private interest since individuals must hear from others what is of value from others. And when interpersonal exchanges transpire, people manufacture a public interest that stems from the resultant pluralist interaction. Individuals' incorporations of others into their own is important because a diverse perspective more accurately represents community needs that emerge from these shared understandings. Individuals navigate their sociability in terms of their ability to properly contribute to and construct their socio-political arrangements and relationships with others. Moreover, the interactive relations between community members dialogically construct the individual herself, since the concepts developed and shared shapes individuals' public and private interests. Christopher McMahon defines collective reasoning as a shared deliberation that marks mutually beneficial cooperation. This reasoning differs from individualist versions of reasoning in that decisions are products of input from each deliberator rather than an aggregate. Collective reasoning begins with individual opinions concerning the target and then moves to converge onto one kind of choice or shared understanding by adjusting and reordering preferences of the interaction. When individual judgments as options and offerings are deliberated upon collectively, the result is more substantively fair and reflective than mainstream liberal democratic practices. For this purpose, I hold that a deliberative, participatory democratic society would be best instantiated using the model of premise-driven collective reasoning. Premise-driven reasoning prescribes processes that even dissenters can recognize as minimally acceptable because they are minimally their own. They would have been active contributors to the pool of reasons that discursively construct shared understandings. The aim of deliberative, democratic, collective reasoning is not to eliminate or ignore self-interest. Rather, the fact of interconnection reveals the extent to which purely atomistic self-interest goes against the grain of freedom and sense-making. Autonomy is the meeting place between self-interest and connection, and premise-driven reasoning offers a path to the reconciliation of negotiated tensions between individual interests. Okay, so a summary of linguistic bodies. According to Ezequiel DiPaolo and Hannah, persons have linguistic agency that is grounded in a linguistic body. This aspect of enactivism crosses sensory motor sense-making with participatory sense-making. When we think about how language is embodied, we must think about how our bodies language. Our linguistic relations to the world emerge from our social interactions with others, which provide the constraints on goal construction and action affordances for our actions. Thus, a linguistic body is a body that is socially situated, socially performed, and comes about from others' agencies and through which others' agencies emerge. Our agency necessarily depends on the kinds of goals others have as well, since their cares and concerns contribute to and shape my own choices. Linguistic bodies navigate the constitutive tension between how I choose to act and how I incorporate others' agency into my own. We develop and enact cognitive powers via linguistic agency through social practices of co-regulation and sense-making. No matter the explicit desire of an actor, patterns of social interaction produce entanglements between the bodies of participants that then create and refine social meanings and understandings, right? The creative responsiveness of enacting itself also drives linguistic bodies to be responsive to others in ways that bolster simultaneously autonomy and relationality. How we choose to incorporate others' actions is a function of how we perceive their actions in relation to our own. They exist in part as an intentionality we have over there, like right there with you, right? Intersubjectivity then rests on a synergy between bodies in daily encounters in the world. We have linguistic agency that is a sensory motor agency because we must incorporate the acts and utterances, embodied and verbal, of others into our assessment of opportunities for action. DiPaolo et al. Define utterances as acts, embodied material patterns, enacted by sensory motor bodies. They have an inherently dialogic structure that orients people towards each other. Uttering in interaction is taking one's turn, as it were, and opens the space for meaningful responses in interaction. As such, they engender the necessary social meaning-making norms of recognition and interpretation. Partial acts are partial because they are initiated by one actor and must be completed by another in order to create the interaction, or the action of the interaction, right? They are used by actors who work together to co-define and co-enact mutually defined sensory motor schemas to facilitate co-regulating enactments. For this reason, gestures function as regulating partial acts to help interactions sustain co-regulation by making choices amongst affordances more obvious via social repetition of these kinds of selections, right? So what enactivism helps us understand, especially with respect to understanding the feasibility of participatory models of democracy, is that we are already inherently engaged in participatory sense-making at the body level. And we are already inherently engaged in entrainments that are instances of embodied collective reasoning. This just is what we're doing every single day, right? It's just liberal democratic models just refuse that existence is real, okay? When we try to understand something as explicit as democratic collective reasoning as an enactive embodied level, it becomes necessary to recognize partial acts as embodied reasons in participatory meaning making. Partial acts are the joint facets of shared know-how in participatory meaning making, right? In completing acts, we have collectively deliberated the best way to navigate a confrontation. I don't like to think of confrontation. I think coming face to face with another's private interest, right? Partial acts are regulatory in the same way that norms are, right? But they are also one communicative piece of a dialectical interaction comprised of embodied participatory sense-making through embodied reason-giving for action. While sensory motor contingencies are generally set and we follow them like a script, we are autonomous and we have ample opportunity for originality to push and even potentially change shared understandings through our bodies, right? So just a quick point, right? Under this description, all partial acts are reason giving. I don't think that that's a particularly difficult claim to make. What I'm trying to put forward is the idea that dancing is a mode of explicit democratic reason giving, so that the dancing itself gives reasons that the audience can use and participate with in public deliberation. So, whew, big jump. Okay. Modes of renegotiation, such as dancing, are ordinary incidents that can take place anywhere to help deliberators better understand the importance of reasons in communities. Dancing as narrative contributes to deliberative democratic procedures, since narrative storytelling of one form or another is how communities go about constructing dominant norms and shared understandings. Dance, as such, is a performative mode of storytelling that functions as a component of a dialectical praxis. Performative storytelling, such as dance, functions within democratic deliberations as a mode of world making, since stories yield, reveal, and embody the ideas of the world and the dynamics within it. So choreographing and dancing is an art of revealing the world and our ideas of it through the body. Storied performativity elucidates the specifically political nature of worlding, and in our case, movement-based dialectics. Moving narrative, right, contributes to ethico-political deliberative practices. Dancing is an operation that allows for an intentional, explicit, political embodied engagement with others as a natural extension of our languaging bodies. Much like community and interpersonal interactions generate shared understandings regarding beliefs and norms, bodies also generate shared understandings through the interactions of our sensory motor agencies. Linguistic bodies develop shared understandings through shared implicit recognition of the meanings that come from sensory motor agency, both through metalinguistic partial acts and the embodied metaphors resultant from our shared syntax. Right? The syntax comes from our sensory motor affective patterns and body schemas that we all typically share as bodies. Embodied metaphors are readable by others because they are shared vis-a-vis physiology and culture. Embodied metaphors can be understood communicatively as connotations, denotations, and declarations. Partial acts operate as connotations, denotations, and for my purposes, suggestions as reasons, right? Embodied metaphors are complete ideas within narrative communication, and partial acts are contributions to dialectics that require bodied dialogues in participatory sense-making. It is important to point out how dancing and even the role of linguistic bodies in decision-making can be a legitimate co-regulatory and cooperative communicative contribution. Liberal democracy and even mainstream forms of deliberative democracy are grounded in ideals of rationality that are antithetical to models of embodied sense-making and knowing. Thus, the account of linguistic bodies and enactivism itself must be situated within feminist frameworks to it to be sensical. Iris Marion Young, the late and the great, offers the ideal framework for linguistic bodies. What she offers is communicative democracy. This democratic schema recognizes the centrality of embodied knowledges and interactions and values styles of speech that are tentative and exploratory. In this model, the body, affect, informality, and intersubjectivity take precedence as the normative modes for participatory sense-making and shared understandings. Significantly, Young emphasizes the necessity of recognizing pluralist modes of interaction, including greeting, which is good for partial acts, rhetoric, and storytelling, which is good for me. When thinking of linguistic bodies as deliberative, democratic interlocutors, the tensions negotiated via partial acts can be seen as purposefully negotiating the tensions of agonistic individual socio-political interests and desires. Partial acts cannot move in the direction of competing individual interest in liberalism because this would cause a breakdown in the participatory sense-making. But they are agonistic insofar as sense-makers maintain autonomy to create shared understandings through sense-making bodied interactions. As such, partial acts are inherently deliberative and democratic by their very nature. That's just what partial acts are, right? Sense cannot be made or shared, which is necessary given the fact of dynamical systems, if one attempts to control and erase the autonomy of another to win, physically or democratically. Liberal democratic models preclude cooperation and eventually facilitate, rather than promote, political breakdowns, because there is an absence of participatory engagements and therefore an absence of community entrainments. Liberal democratic models, therefore, are grounded in competition, and they do not contain normative prescriptions suitable to ensuring universal autonomy. And it certainly cannot sustain individual autonomy. Deliberative democratic models are based on discursive modes of partial acts, broadly construed to ensure equality, freedom, autonomy, participatory shared understandings, and thus individual autopoiesis within a harmonious dynamical system. Partial acts of linguistic bodies can be construed as a form of ethical bodied asymmetrical reciprocity within communicative democracy. This notion of asymmetrical reciprocity does not undermine the anti-domination condition of participatory sense-making of linguistic bodies. What it does, it more accurately signifies the fact of normative negotiation of tensions. The construction of shared understandings does not require a symmetrical tit-for-tat style of interaction because sense requires plurality, and everyone's perspectives have more to offer in some situations than in others, right? So this holds for participatory sense-making as well, because often interactions will necessitate the leading of one partner, and one's leading, or literally physically carrying the weight, embodied interactions of an instance of discourse does not equate to domination. Many interactions require one to defer to the other for the interaction to be successful at multiple normative levels. Strict symmetry of mainstream deliberative democracy can result in inefficiency, inequality, inadequacy, and injustice. So the problem of space and time. While dance is often a form of narrative world making, it does not have to be used in that way. And I always have to put this out there because some dancers get really mad when I talk about it as being narrative. Okay. The idea of dance as a mode of deliberative reason giving follows from the very nature of movement itself. The foundation of what Thomas de France calls corporal orature, qua gesturing speech act, lies in its distinguishing embodied discursive practice of call and response. Dance can function as a form of deliberative reason giving because the dance's nature as a discursive call and response helps it succeed dialectically with a public witness. Communications of embodied forms of knowing through narrative-based story performativity and concomitant ethical practices generates recognizable articulations and expressions of embodied procedural knowledge that can receive uptake by communal witnesses. Public displays of dance can be given uptake because performed stories can be received and realized indirectly through shared phenomenological activities. The procedural nature of this interactive embodied knowing of dancing narrative is consequence of the skillful knowing how on the parts of participants involved in the coming to know through deliberative practices in the ongoing construction of shared understandings. But the more pointed question is how exactly the call and response nature of dancing operates as literal reason giving for uptake and negotiation rather than as just a declaration of one's position in the world. There are a couple of ways to think about this. First, if the performer's, and this is just basic, if the performer's intention is to educate or display, then the dance as an entity can be viewed as declarative. If, on the other hand, the intention of the performer is to connect in participatory sense-making with the audience using moving ideas, then the dancing, the pieces of choreography in action, can function as specific reasons for consideration, with the piece as a whole constituting something like an entire deliberative claim or argument, right? I noted above that embodied metaphors can be conceived of as connotative or declarative. How pieces of choreography constituted by series of embodied metaphors, and y'all don't understand that I think of choreography as stringing together of embodied metaphors for communication, my bad. So it moves away from strict declaration to a series of ideas that are denotative and connotative through dancing transitions. Transitions link the concepts inherent in embodied metaphors together dynamically, and these varying dynamics turn concepts from blunt instruments into an affective dialogue with the witnesses. One can think about the dancing phrases comprised of dancing metaphors, for those of you who've read Enoch Quintan, and my other stuff, as a range of differing levels and kinds of partial acts that must be completed by the public. This is where it gets hairy. The choreographic sequences send out a call via sensory motor patterns, and then the public must complete the sense-making in a participatory manner through a response. Hence our conundrum. Given that linguistic bodies must complete action through interaction for sense to make sense, how do audiences to dance performance complete their side of the interaction in a way that is deliberative? Mysteries. This is possible in one clear-cut sense, right? Basic uptake. Uptake, when given seriously, is an inherently participatory act. It is not the case that every communicative act must be resolved immediately or addressed immediately. Sometimes we feel as if we've been given just the right amount of uptake if the other walks away from our ideas to engage in thoughtful contemplation. But this is cheating, right? I need to say more and better. Communicative democratic models are certainly about securing and prioritizing inclusive norms and praxes of rich uptake to promote equal consideration. A communicative democracy will also call for action in a thicker sense because cooperation does demand substantial interaction in this asymmetrical reciprocal interaction. So the second sense in which the public can provide a response is in perceiving and walking away with actions affordances that are afforded by the reasons within the dance to act on in other spaces and places. One of the aims of communicative democracy is to continually shore up its normative practices for generating just understandings. When witnesses go away with reasons given to them and then incorporate those reasons into their own and then act in accord with the deliberative negotiation, then they can be said to be completing the interaction later with their own partial act. The partial act can be conceived of as behavior that the performers invited them to act. Moreover, affordances for action can yield praxis of questioning as action, which furthers and enriches democratic deliberative cooperation, right? And I have a little bit more using Gallagher's notion of imagination as rehearsal to talk about how using our imagination in response to other sensory motor patterns, right? So if those motor images reignite with us later, it can actually lead us to select different kinds of sensory motor patterns in other physical body-body interactions, right? So communicative democracy doesn't demand that I give my response to you. It demands that I participate with others in a participatory, just way. And so by taking up your dancing reasons with my body, they can then be rehearsed imaginatively in such a way in other interactions that I start seeing other action affordances available, and I start enacting different kinds of sensory motor schemas than I might have had I not taken up your moving reasons, right? So just to get a little more technical about how that works. Okay. So additionally, sensory motor affect patterns bridge self and other, and the discrete individuals are able to conjunctively cultivate empathy in the flesh. Embodied affect theorist Margaret Wetherell, although a functionalist, situates affect within a social context. She refers to the social experience of communicative affect as a contagion, right? This is how we carry things. She explains that affective experience and existence helps us keep the world close to our skin. And an activist, Giovanna Colombetti, identifies it as a sympathetic sociability. The affective practices are coordinated and relational. They are thus distributed across our relational field, which one can think of as our flesh. Each partner's contribution becomes meaningful across this distance, but only in relationship to the whole affective dance of the interaction we're engaged in. The similarity between affect and flesh brings out Wetherell's claims that affective practices are communicative. She explains that they take shape and adjust as the flow in the discursive realm. To help clarify the social communicative efficacy of affect, Wetherell offers the notion of an affective loop, but her loop concerns how affect becomes narrated through the spirals of normative social flow to contribute to and constitute cognitive practices. Similarly, our activist, thank you, Colombetti regards affect as a sort of flesh ontology, where affect can be passed on to others. These ideas reveal that something like Merleau-Ponty's notion of flesh can help carry affect across real distance, and therefore help the reasons of dance extend temporally. Flesh is that which binds us all to each other and to all things, according to Merleau-Ponty. It is the glue that holds us all together. Flesh is what binds our embodied consciousness to others and the world, and through which our skin sops up the vast array of knowledges that become embedded in our bones. But movement moves meaning because it moves us across and into the flesh. Our body moves us into meaning and actively takes up the knowledge into an embodied residence, which is how it can be rehearsed as imagination later with sensory motor schemas, right? Much like affordances, affect as constitutive of dancing reasons, can be carried over time and space through the body to another body. Just in conclusion, ultimately, it is the two conditions unique to communicative democracy, which is feminist by nature, that helps collective reasoning succeed between bodies at a distance. Asymmetrical reciprocity and respectful wonder are the two conditions that make this possible, at least when we're conceiving of it democratically. Asymmetrical reciprocity is a mode of gifting because the other is not expected to reciprocate right away. As such, it creates a social bond between giver and receiver. This social bond harkens to the notion of flesh, across which affect and affordances can be carried. Second, this not only allows for there to be a differential contribution and interaction, it also clarifies why a witness is permitted to walk away with a bodied reason for further contemplation. Any normative prescription of immediate response violates a democratic norm of reasonableness because reason cannot accurately be ascribed to ideas pre-reflectively. And people who make swift responses to significant moral exchanges rarely have given themselves time to consider anything. In any case, it's just rude, right? It's also undemocratic. So respectful wonder works similarly. Young describes respectful wonder as taking the stance of awaiting new insight about the other's perspectives and values. This is significant not only for the purpose of satisfying a generic norm of reasonableness, but because this is the perspective that is necessary for generating authentic deliberation to create shared understandings between bodies across embodied differences. The end.
Thank you very much. So that was excellent and very rich, and I'm very much looking forward to getting into the discussion. So I'm just going to give people a breath to maybe digest some of that. And to remind people that I'll be watching the chat on YouTube, so I can give voice to the questions that are raised there. And we have a couple of people in the Zoom room with us who we might be able to interact somewhat more directly, however mediated that may be. So I guess I'll just offer, if Hannah, you've unmuted yourself, is that a prelude to intervention?
No. No, not really, but yes, no, that was really wonderful, extremely rich, and yeah, it's hard for me to react to it immediately because it's so much. Yeah, what would I like to say first?
So, well, if I might lead with a couple of kind of clarificatory questions. There's one big question that I want to make sure I want to get to, but it kind of feels like I should lead up to it with just a couple of other questions first. And I mean, perhaps one of the simplest ways is to ask and to offer you maybe an opportunity to expand a little bit on something you kind of threw out and recognized as, actually, this is a big deal and I'm just going to move on, please. But if we could, reverse up and just pause with it for a second, that'd be fantastic, which is that notion of choreography as stringing together embodied metaphors. That sort of, I think, is playing quite a bit of role. That in parsing of choreography is playing a big role, and it would be great to unpack it a little bit more.
Yeah, so this just let me do a presentation on the book that's coming out, so you'll want to get it. Okay, so I am a choreographer, and the first time that I ran across embodied metaphors, it was just like, this is it. This is how you choreograph narrative, right? Because especially for me, I do circus. So I'm working in all three dimensions. I'm up and down in speed and upside, like every which way that's possible. And I realized that it's through a purposeful construction of an embodied metaphor using the different dynamics, right? So if I do something upwards and sideways, that's going to mean something different than if I do it sideways but down. And then if I do it fast versus slow, that's also going to change it. So I can use movement to be very, very specific about what I want the audience member to know. This is one of the reasons why, like, without falling into functionalism, right? This is one of the reasons why mirror neurons make it possible for a witness, as we call it, to receive objective knowledge from movement, because a dancer, and this isn't true of all dance, right? This is something that you have to purposefully do. You have to like really work to communicate an idea for objectivity, right? But you can build piece by piece and dynamic by dynamic a concept with your body, and you can string those concepts together. And one of the things that helps create the narrative and like the arc and more of the affective connotations of how these concepts relate to each other is through the transitions between them, right? So I build an embodied metaphor. It is a static body image, right? So it's like concept, but then I need to get to another concept. And I do that by twirling or unrolling or wrapping in a certain way to get to this. And all of those transitions and the dynamics that I use give both a logical relationship between the concepts and also the affective relationship between them, right? So how I move from this one to this one through the movement will also not only tells a narrative, but it changes the inflection of the concept, because it's tempering it in certain kinds of ways, right? So when I do choreography, right, I'm like embodied metaphor, embodied metaphor, embodied metaphor, build these transitions, voila, you have claims, right, and stories that through mirror neurons and all of those other things and affect, empathy in the flesh, like the witness can take up and get it. So that is one of the things that I think about when I'm talking about dance. So like all of these things that I'm talking about, movement and creative movement and embodied interactions, these are all given in activism. These are just the facts of bodies, and that is so smart and so right. And I feel that it gives us all of the tools that performance philosophy and feminist philosophy has been trying to communicate when they talk about embodiment and like its purpose in shaping the world and shaping others. It provides everything that we need to really flesh out these intuitions. And so I use dancing and choreography as really in your face ways of being able to purposefully use it, right? So these things happen to us as bodies with others. We, in dynamical systems, we have entrainments, we have emergences. These things are just happening. But because this is all true and smart and a fact of existence, we can utilize it purposefully. And for me, as a mover, like it was so obvious, but I am using dance in my theory to make it clear, right? You just can't be more clear about how accurate these models are by showing how you can put it into use to manipulate, that's a bad word, but to contribute to meanings and knowings with others through embodied knowledges. So it's almost like I'm being as blunt as possible about why these models are right and are useful and almost necessary to oppression theory through dance as the context and being like, look how we can make it work. And if we can make it work, we can also make prescriptions for how to change these kinds of behaviors, body, if we're thinking about democratic situations. Does that clarify anything?
It does.
I'm sorry, that was a big speech.
Thanks. There's kind of, and it's interesting. It puts me in mind of kind of relatively early, you know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, when there was still, and there remains a lot of this kind of discussion and differences in the way the term embodiment is used and what bodies mean. And you know, what happened over the last few decades is a number of different domains and fields and traditions either discovered or emphasized the body almost in parallel and kind of independent of one another. And there right from the get-go, there was still some cross-fertilization between these groups, and sort of mutual recognition. But since then, there's been that very tentative, how much can we learn from you? You know, this sort of this gradual notion of, we'd kind of like to integrate it a little bit and synthesize things, but we're not quite sure how far to take things. So, I mean, to that extent, that situates for me your work as a kind of, really, if you don't mind me saying, quite strident attempt to just say, right, let's go. You know, it's really, as you kind of said before earlier, let's just take this for a ride. Let's you know, let's see if this thing runs. And as Hannah said, that's meant that there is a real richness and complexity to the kind of ideas that you've laid out. I mean, I guess I'm just going to jump straight, because I realize I know you have to run off soon, and I want to make sure that I get you to comment on this one point, which it is just sort of follows, and I apologize, this is going to be more of a comment than a question, but it's intended in a discursive attitude, which is that so I love the way that you've introduced a particular view of partial acts, and in particular the partial act as, I mean, what I've written down here is either meta partial act or partial meta act. That kind of communicative notion that, I guess in the kind of more information transmissive notion, you have, you know, two individuals on separate trajectories, they come into contact with one another, and there is what we will call impact, and then subsequently they are both changed on different trajectories. Except what you seem to be suggesting, and which just sounds right? It just has that, it seems to very clearly fit with the arguments in linguistic bodies and other arguments from other domains, is that rather than impact, we have, as you say, invitation. That the partial act doesn't require or demand a particular response from me, but it has changed the way I do it. It's almost like I am accented now in a different way than I was before. And speaking in a different accent, it means all of the partial acts that I undertake subsequent to that now have a different certain character to them, which means that the adequate and appropriate coordination and response to them is changed. And so it's not that there's one correct response, but there is a newly, as I say, sort of accented way in which it affects, you know, subsequent partial acts. And that's, in some ways, that's quite challenging, because it means, you know, it's this partial act that cannot be completed.
Well, I mean, I guess the idea is that there's more than one way to think of completion, right? So completion doesn't mean here and now. It doesn't mean that, like, something can be completed later, or like a task is one of the obvious things that gets completed later. Like, we do part of it now and then we go later, and sometimes people complete that for us. So I think when we're thinking of more of a democratic context, and we're thinking about why it is that people can communicate in these body ways, I think that it's important to recognize that this is always happening, and that it's so deep and it's so meaningful that it forever carries with you, right? Because we you know, linguistic bodies talks about, like, my interaction with you has a sort of, there is a set of partial acts that are appropriate to this situation. So if I do this, you're going to do that, and then we're in joint interaction and we're making meaning together. But we carry these sets around with us, right? And so one of the things that causes injustice is when we have, like, hermeneutical gaps that are based on stereotypes and biases, right? So, like, if you walk up to, you know, a person of color and all of a sudden you're like, yo, man, what's up? Like, he's going to be, why is that in your set of partial acts? That doesn't belong there, right? So our interactions with others in the political sphere, and even just the, at the skating rink, like anywhere, is constantly carving out the set of action affordances that we carry with us that we think are appropriate to any kind of act. And so as it turns out, when we're thinking about democratic reasoning and collective reasoning that is a process of shared understandings that occurs over time, we can think of these sets of what we believe to be our opportunities for action as slowly being carved out over time. And then, right, so I'm engaging in participatory sense making with you from body to body that then keeps moving, right? So bodies don't just have a conversation and then the bodies stop talking. The body, it's like mumbling. Like you're constantly mumbling as you walk across the, around the world and interact with other bodies. And this little murmur that's always existing between bodies is shaping the things that we know about the world and is shaping all of our sensory motor affective patterns. And it's very hard to explain, right? It's very hard to explain how this stuff travels. But if we take these things very seriously, we see that it's going to hold in that sense. However, we may have lost our facilitator. Hannah, are you going to take over?
I guess I am.
Yes.
That's
I believe you had some questions anyways, right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. But also it's funny that Marek said this thing about the partial act with the gesture and then the image.
What do you mean by completion?
It was a perfect example. So I wonder, there he is. I wonder in relation to that, I really liked, hi Marek.
Yeah, Marek, just assume that I said something brilliant, right?
Yeah.
And that I solved all of your problems.
So my apologies, I just lost internet connection entirely. So I'm just trying to sort of reconfigure things here. So I'm very sorry about that. I'm not entirely sure what happened, but
we went on without you. It was fine.
Good. I'm glad.
We completed without you.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I wonder.
So sorry, and then I came in and interrupted. So please continue.
Yeah, I wonder, Shay, if you could say a bit more. So following on from that, about the interaction or the communication with the audience, as maybe I really loved also what Marek said in terms of accenting. So somebody moves with it, I think it's true that when you see a performance, you can find yourself moving a little bit like the dancers moved afterwards. So maybe a dance also can put a seed in an audience, like a moving seed, so that people start to move differently, all of them. And this then has an influence, not just on one person, but like you said, but also in a community. This makes a different way of moving possible. And then that gets taken further also between when people in the audience then talk with each other, probably differently. And
it's also the case, right? So like when you watch a performance affectively and sensory motorly, you become moved. Yeah. Right. And so as you watch it, you are moving with them, right? And you will carry that movement with you later. Mm-hmm. But your affect change, like it sinks into your body and it touches you all the way through. It's very glorious, right? If you've ever seen a good one. And everyone next to you is having that sort of same experience. So what you have is this sort of chain reaction of like linguistic body interactions right there where, and this is kind of what I mean about why this can carry, right? So you have these performers who are sharing with you, reasons for why you should care about the things that are important to them. All of these people are watching, so there's the direct witness to dancers interaction, affective interaction and sensory motor interaction, but it's happening amongst all of the audience members themselves. They are literally creating that empathy in the flesh, that affective bond between them. So what you have is a sort of like very, well, hopefully very nice mob, right? Who is interacting with each other as linguistic bodies. Their partial acts are going to change as a result of having seen this performance, right? So you can even think about how, like, when people walk into a performance and they're very disconnected from each other and they're like, I just need to get to my seat and go get the glass of wine, right? And then when you come out of the performance as a group, like, it's like you're more likely to touch people, you want to open doors for people, you want to smile, and like, how is that, like, all of a sudden, like, all of your partial acts are a whole different set for being in a crowd of strangers than it even was before you walked in there. Mm-hmm. And that just continues to, and all of those ways of interacting are typically very ethical and just ways of interacting. They're the kinds of ways of interacting that feminist political philosophers want people to behave on a general basis, right? And then that carries with you, and then this little mob disperses, and then they take these sort of like new accented participatory acts and they go out into the world and hopefully spread it around. It is, you know, as Wetherall was saying, it's an affective contagion. And I think that it's specifically that, you know, Colin Betty says a sympathetic sociality, Wetherall says, you know, this affective loop. I think it is specifically those things that make it possible for bodies to carry their deliberative interactions away, that they can complete with others. Because, you know, a lot of times when you do something in interaction with a person, you're not doing it, like when we don't teach to make them give us things. We teach so that they take it with them. And when they take it with them, they are completing the thing that we did with them. And I feel like that works for broad, general socio-political contexts. I mean, it's quite a bit touchy-feely, but to be fair, like, an activism is just the perfect thing to help justify us being touchy-feely.
Well, I think that is a delightful term on which to end. As it happens, I know we're coming up on our hour, and it's. I want to say thank you very much, Shay, for, as I said, a deeply rich talk and a sort of really engaging and thought-provoking discussion. So I will be walking away with a different accent, with a with measure. Invitation taken up, I think, is and I am very grateful for you coming in and inviting us into that particular discourse. So I want to say
thank you. I've really been looking forward to doing this. Thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute delight, and the very best of luck with the book. I hope it is a great success, and I'll be looking forward to picking up a copy. Out in 2 weeks, so
I'll send you an email and let you know when it drops.
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to that, and in the meantime, I will invite those of you here with us and those of you who are watching online, a very good day, and we will look forward to seeing you again in a month's time for the April ENSO seminar.
Thanks. Thanks for coming, Hannah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. Okay, so we're offline.